in one of the earlier sessions, Robert Novy-Marx discussed a major challenge that the taxpayers in New Jersey, New York, and most other states face that have to do with pension obligations to public employees. I think that as dire as those consequences look, that at least as far as New York is concerned, they understate the case.
He may be right. In all of my academic work, I've really tried to be conservative. The numbers seem big, and people, my critics say that I've blown the problem way out of proportion, but every chance I can, I make conservative assumptions to try and make the problem look as small as possible. So he may very well be right. And on top of that, despite what the states think that they're contributing to paying off the unfunded liability, I actually think that the problem's getting worse every day because they're contributing less each day than the cost of the new accruals to workers. So I don't want to pick a fight with Cliff on that. He may be right.
Studies indicate that 20% of New York State's income tax revenue comes from individuals that work south of about 20th Street in Lower Manhattan. I think that there were lots of fundamentally critical reasons that concentration of very talented, very highly paid individuals was centered on Wall Street 30 years ago. But as the technology's changed, you don't have to bike messenger stacks of paper from one side of Wall Street to another. Most of the transactions today are handled electronically, not with shuffling pieces of paper. That change in the technology has profound implications for how geographically concentrated the financial services industry needs to continue to be. If I were on the board of directors of the Bank of America and knowing that B of A owns Merrill Lynch, I would be insisting on a white paper detailing why any employee of Merrill Lynch that had an office in Lower Manhattan had to be there. Things that could be done out of Charlotte, I would move the job. Rents are lower, secretarial support's less expensive, and things that can be done remotely, things that don't literally have to be done in the shadow of Wall Street, I would move. Now, New York State in general has treated Wall Street like a captive. It has presumed that that concentration of very talented, very highly compensated executives are stuck in Lower Manhattan and will be part of New York State's tax base forever. I think that that's a completely unreasonable presumption. And as other considerations come to the fore, the kinds of things that Robert talked about earlier being a simple example, I think you're going to have more and more financial institutions making very thoughtful, careful, deliberative assessments of, do I really need this vice president on Wall Street, or could I move them to Charlotte? Or, I mean, look at virtually every major financial institution that has a credit card business. It's been moved to South Dakota because they have bid for them through very attractive regulations, tax circumstances, and not only did they bid for them, they got them. We've heard a lot about the dangers of systemic risk in the derivative securities business. And I fear that most of that discussion misses a critically important point and has resulted in capital requirements that are too high in most cases, too low in others, and a set of regulations that are going to hamstring the U.S. financial services industry in continuing to be competitive in the global derivatives marketplace. The critical thing that I think most of these discussions overlook is that if someone that's got a position in derivative securities gets into financial difficulty, that's necessary for default, but it's certainly not sufficient. I mean, if I'm the CFO of a company that has an interest rate exposure, and I decide that to manage that interest rate exposure, I'm going to enter into an interest rate swap, something that would offset this underlying core interest rate exposure, then those circumstances where I'm most likely to be in financial difficulty are going to correspond to cases where someone owes me a check under that derivative securities contract. Unlike loan contracts where at origination I get a check and over the rest of the life of the loan I owe the party on the other side of the desk a check in return, with derivative securities, if prices move in one direction, I owe the counterparty a check, but if prices move in the other direction, they owe me a check. Now, if derivatives are used to hedge exposures, and the evidence that we've been able to come up with is that the vast majority of derivatives, in fact, are used for just those kinds of hedging purposes, then firms that get into financial difficulty are going to be cashing checks, not cutting checks in those circumstances. What that means is that the likelihood that a firm will A, find themselves in bankruptcy court, and B, owe a check is dramatically smaller than the likelihood of just winding up in bankruptcy to begin with. And the set of circumstances that would leave someone in bankruptcy and owing a check are circumstances that are dramatically more idiosyncratic. It's not an interest rate move that put that company in bankruptcy. It's a move in something else. The interest rate move would have, on average, in general, led this firm to a robust financial situation. The more idiosyncratic the set of firms that owe checks on derivatives and yet find themselves in bankruptcy, the more effective diversification is in managing those problems. It's not a systemic risk problem.